National Party, the English Defence League, 40%, according to a recent survey, say they would, of British people say they would support an anti-immigrant party. We're seeing a repeat now of the 1970s and 80s, where we now risk the Muslim community feeling vilified in the way that the black community was in the 70s and 80s, in which young people will see there's no point in getting an education because they see all the police harassment, they see what's going on in society and feel that they never will get a fair deal. It ties in with what Tony was saying, that we do need to get over that self-image. But if you look at it logically, if you have to get to, if you know that Oxbridge only has takes on one black child in a year, and that even if you get 3 A's, the chances are you won't even get an offer from Oxbridge. If you go for a job, discrimination still exists. If you meet the police, the chances are that you'll be stopped and searched. Then what kind of message is that telling to any ordinary child about the state of Britain today? All I can say, just to sum up, is it does suit certain people and their agendas to claim that, yes, we are post-racial, yes, Barack Obama. We didn't say that with the election of Margaret Thatcher that Britain had done away with sexism. It's just equally ridiculous to say Barack Obama's election means an end to racism. Although it's funny that his election has been more used as a stick to beat people who still say racism exists with. So people may want to believe society is post-racial. It may suit their agenda, but the evidence to the contrary is everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. David, do you want to just take a couple of minutes, if you want to, unless you're going to incorporate the diversity is bad thing, just to give you right of reply, basically, but okay, go to the podium.
Well, yeah. A bit of right of reply would be in order, I think. Joseph, it was all anecdote and sort of leftist headline. I don't recognise the picture of Britain, or rather of the British media, which is what you were mainly talking about from what you were saying, this demonising of Muslims. I remember after 7/7, quite extraordinary, the entire establishment, from the Sun through to the Financial Times, all the voices of official and indeed unofficial Britain were out there saying this is not the fault of the Muslims, this is a tiny minority of extremists. Don't people remember that? There was absolutely no Islamophobic vitriol. You provided us with absolutely no evidence for anything that you were saying, except when you started off, you were supporting our case and talking about the enormous progress that has been made. As regards my own piece in Prospect, it was about the tension, the undoubted existence of a tension between diversity, not just racial diversity, value diversity of all kinds, and solidarity. There is a tension, and it is one of the great issues, particularly for the centre-left. If you have societies if you have immigration societies that don't get integration right, then you have the danger that people live more and more separate lives and are not prepared to pay into the common pool to support each other. You can disagree with that, but I think that is a perfectly reasonable point. It certainly is not racist. Anyway, just to start my own pitch, last time I was here was as a young child, going up to the famous revolving restaurant in the early 1970s. And I think then, 40 years ago, if people had told you that 2 generations later we would have more people from ethnic minority backgrounds going to university than white Britons, if you were told that there were at least 2 sizable minorities who outperform the white majority in educational outcomes, and 3 that outperform them in labour market outcomes, employment outcomes, I think liberal-minded people would have been pleasantly surprised. There is, as I don't think anybody would deny, a well-attested decline in prejudice and prejudicial behaviour, partly as a result of legal changes in politics and political struggle indeed, and partly just a result of time passing, people getting used to each other. Over the last couple of generations, you can see that it's well attested. Self-reported prejudice is down very sharply even in recent years. In 1987, 5% of people admitted to being very prejudiced against people of other races, 34% a little prejudiced, and 60% not prejudiced at all. By 2001, that had fallen to just 2% admitting to being very prejudiced, 23% a little prejudiced, and 73% not being prejudiced at all. Some people don't like these self-reported figures, but if you look at what's called the social distance questions, when people are asked about whether they would feel uneasy about a close relative marrying somebody from a different race, whether they'd feel uneasy about having a boss from a different race, all these questions too support the very progressive trend. There are two relevant terms in this motion, race and significant. How significant is obviously to some extent a subjective term here. And you might say that a middle-class white person is not in a position to make a call. Well, I think that is to concede too much to the idea that racism is entirely in the eye of the beholder. This is about weighing the evidence, both subjective and objective, about continuing disadvantage. It would obviously be stupid to deny that there is continuing disadvantage. I think in two areas in particular, there is still a well-documented ethnic penalty in the labour market, and there are obviously particular questions about the criminal justice system, particularly in relation to Afro-Caribbean young men. But I think one of the traps that the other side fall into, apart from a certain kind of leftist conservatism, is the belief that any unequal outcome is assumed to be the result of prejudice. As Munira Mirza pointed out, perhaps rather flippantly, this would make the Football League institutionally racist against Asians. And in terms of this judgment question, I want to quote an observer of the scene who is from a minority background, and indeed is a former chair of the Runnymede Trust itself, Samir Shah. He says, "Too much of the race relations industry is now scouring the country for a demon that now thrives mostly in isolated pockets of bigotry. Race as a factor that determines one's progress in life should take its place alongside a wide range of other characteristics, style, class background, accent, dress sense, and so on." Just quickly to run through some of the success story. Education is very well known that both Chinese and Indian students do significantly better than white Britons in educational outcomes, and black Africans, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis do only marginally worse. And as I've already said, more minority Britons go to university than majority Britons. In employment terms, about 40% of white Britons are members of what sociologists call the salariat. 45% of Indian Britons are, 44% of black African Britons are, and Chinese as well is also well over 40%. What this suggests is that class, culture and geography are more important than race in determining life chances. Or to put it another way, being non-white is not a disadvantage. Indeed, the worst performing group educationally and in the labour market is white working class males. I think it's wholly implausible to believe that there's some small group of crafty racists who are determining who succeeds in this ethnic Premier League. Indeed, the whole approach of our opponents attributes too much power to racial attitudes. It also, by the way, implies too easy a solution to the problems of some of the groups who are not performing so well, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis and Afro-Caribbeans. It implies that you just remove a few racists or banish racial thinking and all will be fine. So, in summary, you are far more likely to succeed if you are born into a middle-class Indian family in Harrow than a white working-class family in Oldham. A combination of race and class is clearly still important in determining life chances, but now belonging to the right minority is just as likely to confer advantage, and belonging to the wrong bit of the majority will confer disadvantage. Partly the result of the internal culture of these groups, or castes, as Tony puts it, attitudes to ambition, to education, to mobility, and so on. So race as such is not a major factor of disadvantage, even if belonging to a particular race might be. Race might still matter if you're trying to get a mechanic's job in Rochdale or Burnley, but it won't matter at all if you're a graduate working in a city law firm. And even to the extent that race does still hold people back in Britain, what is the more useful myth, as Tony and admittedly Joseph also said, Is it useful to say the cards are still stacked against you and you're a helpless victim, or that this is an essentially decent society and you can get on if you try? Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Afua.
Thanks, Razia. I would love to believe that race is no longer a significant disadvantage in this country, but even if I did, which, as I'll make clear, I don't, David would have just killed that for me. He just acknowledged that there is an ethnic penalty in the labour market and in the criminal justice system. I would love to know what is not significant about being disadvantaged in those two areas of society if you are an ethnic minority. I can't think of two more important areas of life than work and crime. If we acknowledge that minority people are still disadvantaged in those domains, which the opposition have, then in a way the argument is already won. But I just want to take this back to the level of some facts, because we've heard lots of arguments, but for me, this is the incontrovertible case. There are in this country currently no minority cabinet members. There has never been an ethnic minority prime minister. In the last election, the Liberal Democrats were the only party to articulate policies committed to race equality, but they are also the only party with not a single minority MP. There are only 3 minority High Court judges. Not one of those judges is in the highest court, one of the highest courts in the UK. The Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court still has not a single minority judge. Until 2009, there were no black CEOs of FTSE 100 companies. Now, there is one. There is only one minority general counsel of a major corporation in this country. There has never been a minority editor of a major national newspaper. The list goes on. There are many consequences of this state of affairs, but one of them is that for the few minority people who do succeed in this society and make it to those high levels and positions of power and influence, they are highly visible. And many of them will say themselves, and they've said to me, and it's been widely reported, that they feel that they still need to do twice as much to succeed and half as much to fail. As Joseph pointed out, there's still a debate around the causes of this disadvantage, and I think Tony also went into that. But to me, the question of whether black people themselves are to blame for the persistence of this disadvantage and whether the causes of it are actually in the community itself is not really the point. I'm not interested in who's to blame. What I'm interested in is whether this disadvantage still exists. And faced with the facts that I've just set out, I can see why minority people, on the whole, feel without any shadow of a doubt that it does. The effect of exclusion from almost all positions of power in this society means that many minority people, and especially young people, feel that they are being forced to comply with institutions that don't represent them. And it's easy to be dismissive of the idea that there's an us and them scenario, and that the establishment in this country is white, which is something you often hear young people say. But I'm just going to read you a section. Everyone's invoking Barack Obama, so I'm going to follow suit. He always gets drawn into both sides of this debate. But I'm just going to read you a section from his autobiography, Dreams from My Father, when he explains how this psyche affects a young black person. He says, "We were always playing on the white man's court. If the principal or the coach or the teacher wanted to spit in your face, he could, because he had the power and you didn't. If he decided not to, if he treated you like a man or came to your defense, it was because he knew that the words you spoke, the clothes you wore, the books you read, your ambitions and desires were already his. You couldn't even be sure that everything you had assumed to be an expression of your unfettered self, the humour, the song, the behind-the-back pass, had been freely chosen for you. At best, these things were a refuge, at worst, a trap. Following this maddening logic, the only thing you could choose as your own was withdrawal into a smaller and smaller coil of rage, until being black meant only the knowledge of your own powerlessness, of your own defeat. And the final irony, should you refuse this defeat and lash out at your captors, they would have a name for that too, a name that could cage you just as good: paranoid, militant, violent nigger."